Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's technical assistance call on working with homeless shelters to house survivors of human trafficking. We're very excited to bring today's follow-up session in response to the overwhelming engagement and questions that came up during last month's webinar on this topic. And we're very fortunate to have the same set of presenters join us today to be able to answer some of the questions that came up and also questions that you may have today. So we just want to go over some of the engagement tools just so you can be familiarized on how you can access and engage and interact with us throughout today's call and webinar. So you'll notice that there are three features at the bottom of your screen. These will allow you to use the chat box, raise your hand, and also access closed captioning. The first one, you'll see the chat box will allow you to ask questions, give comments, or if there's something that you are using in your local community or resources that have been useful to you, please feel free to share those in the chat box with all panelists and attendees. It's really useful for everyone to be aware of the different resources and the different ideas that you may have. So please feel free to share those with everyone. And if there are questions that you have throughout the presentation, please feel free to use that as well to submit those questions. Towards the end, we'll have some opportunity to have some Q&A outside of what has already been submitted and some of the questions that have already been identified. And so at that point, if you have additional questions outside of the chat box, then you can use the raise your hand feature and we can use that tool as well. And then finally, like we mentioned, there is that closed captioning, which is the CC sign that will allow you to have that transcript on your screen as well. So just to make sure that the chat box is working, can you just type in where what organization you're from and also where you're located, just to make sure that we're seeing that on our end and that it's working. So we'll just wait a couple of moments to have people type that in. And if you could do it to all panelists and attendees, just to make sure that that feature is working. Okay, so we have some people from New York, Houston, Texas, Buffalo, South Carolina, Seattle, Ohio, great, Kentucky, DC, some more New York. Great, so that seems like it's working, and now you know how to use that feature. Perfect. So let's go ahead and get started. As you are probably aware, and for those of you who are new to these webinars and to the follow-up calls, these are being hosted by the Freedom Network Training Institute. We host a number of bi-monthly webinars on housing topics through the Housing Training and Technical Assistance Project, which is meant to address housing for survivors of trafficking and really support anti-trafficking service providers in being able to have the resources and feel equipped in order to have the knowledge on different housing systems and opportunities that they may be able to use as a referral. Like I mentioned, we do bi-monthly webinars, so we look out for an announcement for the July webinar. And you can also find additional resources, such as fact sheets, on our resource library by going to freedomnetworkusa.org. And we make sure that we share those links with you as well at the end, so that way you have those readily available. We want to present our speakers today. Again, we're very excited to be able to have the presenters from last month's webinar in order to clarify and also troubleshoot some of the questions or challenges that you may be facing in your practice or organization. And so first we have Amy Fleischauer. She's the Director of Survivor Support Services at the International Institute of Buffalo. And they have a team of case managers which she manages, and they serve survivors of human trafficking and domestic violence. She's also a project consultant for the USCRI Trafficking Victim Assistance Program, and she provides training and technical assistance for organizations who are administering that direct care to foreign-born survivors of human trafficking. We have also Beth O'Neill. She's the program director. Sorry, not Beth. She wasn't able to join us today, but we have Stephanie Bratnick, who's a trauma specialist, and she has over 10 years of experience working in crisis and conflict intervention. She is the director of the Preble Street Anti-Trafficking Service Program, and she has developed a conflict mediation course for communities in Mexico, as well as designing tools for cultural competency in assertive behavior in China. So she has a lot of wonderful experience that she's bringing on. And finally, we have Swamirs Pirano Guzman, who's the senior program coordinator for the Washington Anti-Trafficking Response Network at the International Rescue Committee in Seattle. He's graduated from the University of California, San Diego with a master's in psychology. It has years of experience developing curricula and providing training on trauma-informed care, mental health, and human trafficking. So we're very excited to have all three panelists joining us today to answer some of the critical questions that you've submitted and identified in this topic on serving survivors through homeless shelters. So the first question, we're going to direct it to Stephanie. And the first question that came up is, how can homeless shelters offer a welcoming space for survivors?
Sure. So I think space is a pretty general term that can be interpreted in a variety of ways. I mean, I think we're going to go more in depth in a couple of questions about trauma-informed practices. So I don't want to spend too much time on that, but I think the more trauma-informed a homeless shelter can be, the more welcoming the space will be. Because a lot of the needs and what makes a welcoming space for survivors is going to be the same. It's going to be the same for anyone staying in a shelter. They're also going to want the same kind of welcoming space. But so to answer more concretely, that I think creating an atmosphere of safety and respect for all residents that are staying there is very important. If there's a possibility of having some kind of semi-private space, can be critical. Even if it's just a curtain that can be drawn between beds, that can really help. As well as the design of the actual space, the layout. The more open the space can feel, the warm colors, certainly walls that don't necessarily touch the ceiling can be very important. Is it a space that we walk into that we feel relaxed, that we feel comfortable, that we feel safe in? As well as staff being easily accessible. So the importance of having staff offices on the shelter floor so that they feel that staff are available to speak with if there's something that goes wrong, if they just need to see a friendly face. That can be very important.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephanie. The next question that we have, we're going to start with Swamirs, and then also Stephanie and Amy, if you'd like to chime in, is what does the intake process look like, especially thinking about systems used in the housing world, such as HMIS or coordinated entry, and do they present a barrier to confidentiality?
Thank you, Karen. Yeah, through our partnership with, I spoke about our partnership with Salvation Army on the last webinar that we did on these. They did bring out the HMIS and the coordinator entry and how there were questions that needed to answer, there were information that needed to be inputted there. And we talked about it too, and I talked about in the last webinar about the compromise, right? How do we are able to come up with a really good agreement that allow us to share information, allow us to be able to provide an intake process through the shelter that is as best trauma-informed and person-centered as possible. Something that we created was as part of the agreement with the Salvation Army, it was to help them decrease the information that they needed to put in HMIS, but also decrease the intake process for them. So we created created an information sharing form, and we attach, with that document, we attach a release of information that it pertains very specifically to the housing needs of our clients. So we were able to create a ROI that looked at very specific items, such as the information being shared, their name, phone number, or nationality, and all that information. And so we provide that, the one pager, the information sharing form, we provide that ahead of time. So that not only cuts down the intake process on the Salvation Army end, but also it kind of we're able to provide them a lot of the most of the information they need to do the intake. That was also to cut cost when it comes to interpretation, and when it came to the staff time. So what that looks like to us is that we will create that information sharing form. We will share that with the Salvation Army, and for us, it's literally maybe a 20-minute intake process, because we already provided a name, we provided biographic information, gender information, date of birth information, but we also provided some other accommodation information, such as medical needs, religions or cultural needs, and also dietary needs, right? And a lot of these things were done in accordance to what information needed to be on the HMIS, and also acknowledging that some clients may not be needed to be input in HMIS. At the beginning, they had to input everybody on HMIS, but now that we are, through our collaboration, we're able to secure funding and bring it in. We didn't have to do HMIS because they're not using HUD funding or homeless reduction funding. But at that time, we really had to ensure that we're providing as much as information as possible to them, while still keeping that confidentiality of our client and our privilege as advocates to our client. So we had to do a lot of negotiations and a lot of compromising on how we're going to do that. And of course, we then brought it back to our clients. We let our clients know what is that information looks like, what information we're going to share with Salvation Army, should they choose that option of going into that shelter. So they make the informed decision, and they sign an ROI saying that it's okay to share that information. But eligibility or going into a shelter is not dependent on them sharing this information with us, because at the end of the day, they can also go to the Salvation Army and go to their regular intake process. When it came to the coordinator entry, it did, I think, that's more into like long-term housing for us here in Seattle. It did present a confidentiality issue, but the reality is that at the end of the day, our clients are the ones are either eligible for, they get to choose whether if they want to provide that information to coordinator entry or to a local housing provider that needs that information. So a lot of these really came down for us providing our clients with a lot of education and information so they can make an informed decision whether to move forward, and with the needs of the information people are the shelters are requiring in order for the intake to go smoother, but also to cut down their times, because we also acknowledge that while we are a trauma-informed person center, and we also train the people at the shelter. We don't know what are the conditions of the shelter in that very moment of intake. So we wanted to make sure that we reduce as much harm as possible in case there was a new staff, they were not fully trained on trauma-informed care or the trauma-informed intake process for us. So we got ahead of a lot of these things through our partnership agreement with the Salvation Army.
Great, thank you, Swimmers. And for those who may not be as familiar with HMIS or what coordinated entry is, are you able, Swimmers, to give us just a quick overview of what those systems are meant to do?
I am not an expert at all on these systems, but what I can tell you about HMIS, which is the Homeless Management Information System, it is a system developed by HUD that primarily seeks to gather. This system is given to shelters and other housing service providers for them to track down the homeless housing statistics. It is not an intuitive intake process. It asks a lot of private private and very intimate questions at some times. So we had to work with the Salvation Army to say, okay, these questions may not even, it's not relevant to our clients. These questions are relevant to our clients, or, it's really, and to ensure, it was also an education opportunity for Salvation Army to know that some of these questions may not be questions that we need to ask people, more questions that we need to evaluate, given and evaluate those questions and answer those questions with the information that we know from our clients. So it's not an easy process. It talks a lot. It has a lot of questions that can be somewhat triggering. So I would recommend anybody that whenever using the system or working with a shelter that uses the system to really, to talk to the service provider and let them know kind of how some of these questions can be triggering or can be re-traumatizing for some of our clients. Coordinator entry, I'm not really sure how it works in other states. And here in Washington, for example, coordinator entry, that has to do with anything to do with housing or long-term housing, Section 8, so any type of like domestic violence housing. They have to go through a coordinator entry process, and they have to go through that that intake process. And it's not intuitive, it's not really easy, but we only use the coordinator entry when our clients are eligible, either because they are critically homeless, or they have children, or they qualify for something for Section 8 or something like that. Most of our clients don't, but when they do, we'll go through that process, and it's a lengthy process, almost a 2 or 3 hours intake process that looks at all of the financial and housing needs of a person, and then once that person goes through the coordinated entry interview and documentation, is placed in a waiting list until a housing opportunities open up for them, either an apartment or some type of voucher for people to get reduced rents. But anything that has to do with housing, with long-term housing or subsidized housing in Section 8 has to go through a coordinated entry process here, because the coordinated entry process looks at all housing programs within the county and all housing programs within a regional sector. So the coordinated entry program here in King County looks at the subsidized housing in Pierce County, Snohomish County, and Kitsap County. So people have options if they choose to move around or relocate within the regional areas. I think that is something more within Washington, not necessarily within other states. So that is how we have been able to work with the HMIS system and coordinated entry. That was not brief at all. I'm sorry.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you. And Stephanie, working with a homeless shelter and as an anti-trafficking provider, do you have anything else to add to this point?
No, I don't. That was a very thorough answer, Samir. I have nothing else to add.
Great, thank you. All right, we're going to go ahead and move forward. The next question that we want to address is, what trauma-informed practices can shelters adapt to serve survivors? So we're going to go ahead and start with Amy, and then we'll turn it over to Stephanie as well.
Hi, everyone. So I thought I would just start with this question and just talking about from a human trafficking service provider point of view, what we look for and what information we are looking to gain when we partner with homeless shelters. And then I'm going to pass on the rest of the questions to Stephanie, who can really talk about it, certainly grounded more in from a shelter perspective. So I think for us here at the Institute, again, we are an organization that specializes in trafficking case management, and we do not run a shelter. We partner with, I think we're up regularly with about 7 different shelters. What we want to make sure is that we can be transparent with any survivor who's considering shelter about what that experience may be like for them when they walk through the doors, or even when they're going through the intake process on the phone. So I know that this question is likely aimed at a trauma-informed approach for survivors. But I think part of that is having a trauma-informed response, or the transparency and collaboration part of trauma-informed care with providers that are going to make referrals to your shelter. And so I think, as I explained before, there are some shelters in our area that espouse practices that we wouldn't see as having a human rights-based approach, or wouldn't align with harm reduction practices. And that's something that we have actively worked on and improved through our collaborations, but some have not improved. And so our goal always is to be able to espouse client choice and just talk to them about what that might be like. So, when I say what that might be like, what staying at shelter would look like for them, especially including all of the potential triggers and re-traumatization that they may experience through quote unquote typical practices at shelters. So one of the things that's important to us is to see the intake form that survivors will be walked through at a homeless shelter. And jumping off what Swamir's just talked about, typically there's an HMIS intake, but there's also a separate shelter intake. And so as he said, how can we minimize asking the same questions by having consents signed between our agencies? And then also talking about, and we've actually done this by having a case manager request to come over and literally role play doing an intake at that shelter, seeing the rooms. Again, this might have been initially frowned upon at confidential locations or in domestic violence shelters, or for very good reasons when there are other clients around, that would be breaking confidentiality. But as we earned trust and even worked with survivors who've stayed there, we've had a better idea of literally what that process has looked like. So we want to see the intake. We want to see, if possible, what a room would look like. We want to ask about the rules. So are they posted? Are they shared? Do clients sign off on them? And then can we have a copy, again, so that clients can make an informed choice about where they want to go, but also to prepare them. Things are always less triggering, and I don't mean to say that those triggers can be eliminated, but things are less triggering when one knows what to expect, and also sometimes what the reason might be. So looking through someone's bag or searching someone's bag upon intake can very obviously and understandably feel like something a trafficker would do, and therefore be triggering. If the rule is explained prior, that can at least minimize that re-traumatization, and maybe the reason around that could also help the survivor understand that, for instance, people have come in with weapons, or people have come in with drugs that have been triggering for other residents of that shelter, or have been triggering in that way, and that these rules were, for example, created by the shelter residents so as to increase safety for the community. So that's just kind of surprised me at different points when I've explained to a survivor, for example, that one of the rules for a transitional housing program was to notify the emergency shelter staff, which was in the vicinity of the transitional housing unit, when they were having a visitor. That felt very controlling. But when I explained that this was so that the staff could say to other residents, this happened to be a domestic violence shelter, we're expecting a person to come, and they're going to be going to one of the transitional units, that minimized triggers for the other residents who were in constant fear that their abuser or trafficker was looking for them, would find them, or would send a friend. So that why can be, I think, a trauma-informed practice that we can share with a survivor prior to applying for or being referred to the shelter itself. So I think that's just all I wanted to say around the overall trauma-informed approach, that transparency and strong collaboration with a trafficking program can help both the shelter programs and the trafficking programs minimize triggers for survivors upon entering shelter. And with that, I'll hand it over to Preble Street.
Thank you. Yeah, so I want to add on to what was just said, and also point out when we're talking about trauma-informed practices for survivors, we also are talking about these are trauma-informed practices that can be used for any client who is staying at a shelter who has experienced trauma, childhood trauma recently, as well as traumatic stress. And so when we're talking about that, we're talking about traumatic stress and trauma dysregulates us, and it can mean that clients and survivors can easily become dysregulated, either in hypoarousal or hypo. So the techniques that we want to be incorporating are to support clients to not become dysregulated. And there are various things that we can do. We want to offer as much opportunity for client choice as possible. And I can't say that enough, which also goes hand in hand with the rights-based approach. So how is the client leading their own planning and their own time at the shelter? So offering as much choice as possible within the boundaries of your own internal structure. Being aware of trauma-informed language, and I'm not going to go too deep into this because just a plug for another webinar. There's going to be a more specific webinar coming up next month on trauma-informed practices for shelters. But trauma-informed language is important, and that is not just about the words that we use or the phrasing that we use, which we want to mimic the language that the survivors are using to describe their own experience and not placing our own judgments on them, as well as understanding how our tone of voice and our body language is perhaps sending certain cues that we're not intending, but really paying attention to our tone of voice and our body language. Safety and crisis planning with staff is really important, and it's a place where clients can talk about their own experiences and define what they're seeing, what they think is the most safe choice for themselves. That also goes into service and goal planning, which is a chance for a client to take back ownership over their life, to find a place of empowerment. Other things, I would also recommend that you have all material that in a written format. Sometimes when people are struggling with stress and trauma, it can be very difficult for them to understand the actual verbal language and process it immediately. So having something that they can read later on can be very, very helpful. Also, just basic tools for regulation, such as fidget balls, stress balls, Play-Doh. These can that can also help if you're to have around the space, to have during community meetings or in one-on-ones with staff. I would also say on that line, having opportunities for survivors to find a purpose in their life and to form community can be a very, very powerful tool for healing and be a powerful tool for trauma-informed practices. What else? I would say, thank you. That goes a long way. Just being able to say those two words, thank you, like thanking survivors for coming to the shelter today if they're just arriving, thanking them for showing up, thanking them for doing certain things can be very, very important, that we are acknowledging the coping skills that they're using and validating that in a positive way. So yeah, those are my thoughts. If anyone has anything else that they would like to ask or add in.
This is Amy. I love that. I love that. Thank you. I think that, and again, we're going towards, as you said, general trauma-informed practices. But one of the things that I try to do as the director of the program is that anytime there will be a new survivor who's coming to our office for the first time, I just ask the case managers to let me know. And if I'm in the office that day and available at that time, I make it a point to greet them as the director and be the one to offer them something to drink, something to eat. I bring them their coffee as the case manager settles in with them. And that's a very intentional way to try to, another way to show a welcoming atmosphere, and also work against that power dynamic that's just innate in someone seeking services from us, like as the director that I'm the one getting coffee. So it's just such a great point to say thank you for seeking services here, coming to shelter. I think that was I just love that point. Thank you, Stephanie.
Amy, as you were just talking about that, I also I want to point out to that it's about partnership, about building a partnership with survivors and also with anyone who's staying in the shelter, that we are here to be working together. No one is here working, judging anyone or having control of the other people, that we really want to be able to support an atmosphere that we are working towards the same goals, with the survivor leading those goals.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Stephanie and Amy. That has been extremely useful. The next question that we have is around intakes. This actually is for Stephanie as well. So before we get to the intake part, and the question comes through as far as, how do you advocate for transgender individuals who may feel unsafe in a homeless shelter?
Sure. I think I think I mentioned this under question 1, that it does come down to the basic safety and respect expectations for everyone in the space. That includes staff, that includes survivors, that includes other residents, that we really want to make sure that there are expectations for everyone's safety and respect. So that can look like staff supports addressing if there's misgendering happening. We want to address it immediately in the moment, in a polite and respectful way, if that is appropriate, if that's okay for the transgender individual. Some people don't want other community members in the shelter to know, so that's also something that we would want to clear up during an intake, asking, are you okay if we address this in the moment, and allowing the transgender survivor to lead what they feel comfortable with, and we will follow that. During our shelter community meetings, we do set those norms and those ground rules, and we talk about that when we have those community meetings. We also work with community partners and resources for transgender individuals and make sure that they have a presence in the space, that it's open for them to come in and perhaps have a lunch with some of the residents or be around at activities. But I also want to say, we also have a formal hate speech letter that is issued to clients when it's observed or heard that they are using any kind of hate speech. It's really simple and straightforward. I'm happy to type it up. It's maybe 3 sentences. I'm happy to type it into the webinar chat box if people want to take a look at what that language is that we're using.
Great. Yeah, that would be, I think, really useful.
I do.
Okay. All right, I'm going to type it up. That's all. That's my answer for that question. But I'll go ahead and type in that hate speech letter.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And as you're typing, we're also going to be starting with the next question, which I know Stephanie you can speak to, but also if Somiris and Amy, if you have any thoughts on this, is what type of shelters are safe for youth survivors? And so if you all want to, Stephanie, if you're ready and you want to get us started, if not, Amy and Somiris, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I'm just typing, so maybe someone else wants to chime in first.
I can. This is Swamiris. I can perhaps get us started. This is a very open question, and honestly, it really comes down to what the youth feel. If it is a minor, obviously, let's try to find a shelter that houses minors primarily, and adheres to in that shelter. I hope that adheres to the principle of care, dignity, and respect. If it is of somebody over the age of 18, of course, I think it really comes back though to the informed decision of the person, right? We will tell a shelter, a homeless shelter, is an option to our client. We let our clients know what do they expect, what the living condition looks like, what is the check-in and check-out process, what is all of that process looks like for them, and what are their rights and responsibilities as far as being in the shelter, so the youth can make that decision whether or not they want to go into a shelter. However, I think it also comes down to the relationship that you as the anti-trafficking service provider have with the homeless shelter, and developing and helping them develop those skills of safety and what safety really looks like to youth, and how we ask these questions, because the reality, what safety may look like to me, it may look so differently to a young person, and so we have to be able to ask young people what safety looks like to them. Is it the space? Is it their immediate quarters? What that really looks like to people? So it is hard to make an assumption. We cannot make assumptions, but at the same time, we can work with the shelter to ensure that they are aware of the complexities of trauma, or they are aware of how to create a trauma-informed space for survivors. They are aware of the complexities of human trafficking, what that looks like, and of course the principles of empowerment, dignity, and respect. Right, and I think that is absolutely necessary, especially for a young person who's still trying to develop their own, still trying to find their calling, who they are. So whatever space we provide for them, it has to be conducive for this youth to continue to develop as they're going through the process of acknowledging their trauma and working through their trauma.
This is Amy. Thanks, Somiris. I'm going to use the fancy options here and just ask for the participants to raise their hand if they have heard in their communities that the only answer to this question is youth detention. Here might just where the raise your hand. Isn't there one on this? Yes, more. Or even in the chat box. Has anyone heard that in their community? I feel like I hear this all the time.
Amy, would you mind repeating the question?
Sure. I'm just wondering if anyone on the call often hears that the only answer to what type of shelters are safe for youth survivors is detention, youth detention. It's just something that I have heard quite often, and I know that it's not exactly what's being asked here, but I just want to point out that it's important, I think, to have a relationship with the family court system to talk about the importance of not locking kids up for their own safety. Back to the point that Swamirs was finishing up his remarks about, I think that just because someone might not be legally old enough to make certain choices about their lives doesn't mean that we shouldn't be offering choice, because what we know is that when, especially for survivors who have been exploited and have lack of choice as part of their exploitation, which is frankly all of them, the ability to make choice makes all the difference in how your relationship with them can move forward. And so putting them in detention is just takes that away immediately. And so we've, over time, I'm trying to think, probably the last 8 years, have had sometimes painful and painstakingly slow conversations with the family court system around emphasizing choice, and also getting, for the survivor, and really getting at the court system's, like, what is the root of that decision? And a lot of times it's fear, right? That they're just afraid that the youth will be killed, or that they'll overdose, or that, you know, whatever that is, and really talking through what other options we can provide to at least minimize that, while still espousing choice. And what I would say is that when youth are offered trauma-informed services and offered choice, that their likelihood of staying at a shelter or staying engaged in services, and therefore staying safer, will increase. And again, that's not an easy answer, and so it's not something that a lot of systems necessarily like to hear, but it's something that we are bringing up consistently with our partners.
I also want to add in the element of harm reduction and low barrier approach when working with youth who have been trafficked, and how important that is to encouraging them to use shelters. At our teen shelter at Preble Street, it does use those techniques of harm reduction, of engaging in those conversations around substance use and perhaps self-harm or sex work, and advocating that if people are going to be engaging in behaviors that may be quote unquote risky, that people are doing it in the safest way possible, and that we would not turn away a youth or turn them over, let's say, as Amy was just talking about, to law enforcement or to family court, with the understanding that we also are mandated reporters, and that we do walk this line for youth, that at some point, if there is certain behavior that is disclosed or treatment that is disclosed, that we would need to report on that. But also this low barrier approach, so really making the shelter as accessible as possible, is very, very important when working, especially when working with youth.
Wonderful. Thank you, Samirs, Amy, and Stephanie. We're going to go ahead and move on to our next question. And this is on the intake side of things. So the question is, what sort of questions can be included during intake for survivors of trafficking? So we're going to go ahead and start with Samirs, and then Amy and Stephanie, feel free to chime in.
Thank you, Karen. I think when it comes to the intake process at a homeless shelter, that perhaps we are unaware that, or we are looking for indicators or vulnerabilities to human trafficking. These are some suggestions. I will always recommend people on acknowledging their own community, their own culture, their own kind of how the vulnerabilities of their own community, and kind of come up with questions. There are the seeks to find out perhaps, or seeks to get information, whether if that person is able to have access to their documentation, have they ever been forced to exchange sex for money, food, or other needs. Perhaps one way, some of the ways to phrase some of those questions is somebody holding your passport? Do you have access to your passport or ID at any time? Where do you eat or sleep? Do you owe money to your employer? What is your working condition looks like? have you ever been in need and had to exchange or were forced to have sex in exchange for money, a place to sleep, or a plate of food? That can be some of those questions that really that allows you to kind of just find, perhaps, or that allows you for some of those red flags to go off, or some of those gut feelings to go off, and then you kind of use your motivational interviewing skills to kind of to go into asking more questions that could potentially lead into that person being referred to an anti-trafficking service provider, or to a provider who is able to provide case management related to trafficking needs of a person. So again, I would recommend a shelter or to work with local nonprofits or doing anti-trafficking work, or even reach out to, I don't know, I'm going to volunteer here, Freedom Network perhaps. I even think that maybe it's good for even Freedom Network to come out with a set of questions to give out to shelters for them to incorporate into the intake process. And in these questions, however, shouldn't be seen as a qualification for service or anything. I think it should be seen as we need to, the community you're working with, homeless community or critically homeless community, are people who are vulnerable to human trafficking. So being able to ask those questions could then allow the shelter to make referrals, but it shouldn't be a perhaps eligibility requirement. Asking whether this person is a trafficking survivor or not shouldn't be an eligibility requirement for a housing provider to open up housing opportunities for people in general, but also in this case survivors of trafficking. That is one of those questions I can come up with.
Great, thank you.
I just wanted to say, I know this is maybe expanding outside of the question, but talking about like how the intake gets administered is so important. And remembering to always offer room for breaks if the survivor wants or needs to step out of the room or needs a glass of water, that ensuring that the intake is happening in a way where the survivor feels like they are empowered and they are leading it and they can step away from it if they need to, is so important, as well as letting them pick where they want to sit. If there are 2 chairs in the room or there's an option, understanding that it's better to do these in well-lit areas, that a survivor might not want to sit in a position where they cannot see the exit or be close to the exit, is also important when we're talking about intakes.
Great, thank you so much.
Can I chime back in? I'm sorry.
Back in, yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. As Stephanie was speaking, I think it brought some thoughts back together. I think it's important that if shelters or housing service providers or emergency housing service provider ask these questions or incorporate intake questions that related to trafficking, the shelter must have systems in place to not only to deal with disclosure, to working with somebody who those questions may bring up memories or flashbacks or triggering situation, but also the shelter itself has to have the correct relationships to ensure that the trafficking needs of a person are being met. So unless you have relationship with service providers who are doing trafficking work, I wouldn't recommend asking these questions, to be honest, because otherwise you're going to be opening up a Pandora box that potentially is not going to lead anywhere other than re-traumatization or reactivation of trauma of a person who have experienced trafficking. That can be really hard to say, but at the same time, I will say acknowledge that is important to ask these questions, but I acknowledging that you need to have the correct relationships to deal with disclosure and deal with the appropriate referrals for services.
I also, as you're talking, Swimmers, this is Stephanie again, another thought as well, that it might be obvious, and I don't know if it's standard across all the shelters, or the people who are on this webinar, but remembering that if you're going to be asking these questions, it has to be done alone and in a place that's private and confidential, where it cannot be overheard. And that's obviously for the safety of the client, but also remembering that we have also had clients who have been trafficked by by other members of the shelter, or other people in the shelter may have been part of their trafficking experience, and remembering that that's very important to keep in mind, that they will not want to be disclosing this information if there is a threat in the space, is really important.
Thank you. That actually leads us very nicely into our next question. And it's on what type of mental health recovery can be expected or is typically experienced by a survivor. So we'll start with Samirs, and then Stephanie, and also Amy, feel free to chime in.
A loaded question, perhaps. When it comes to what are the mental health expectations for recovery, you have to understand that trauma. It's very fluid, right? And it will affect. There's not a one blanket statement that I can tell you that it is going to fit all, because trauma is very individualized, and the way that we internalize trauma and the way that the trauma imprints and affects our brain is different. But I think it's understandably so. Perhaps if I were to talk to you, if I were to talk about youth who have experienced trafficking, you kind of see different perhaps behaviors. And usually these behaviors are confused with rebellion or being rude or manipulative. But the reality is that the acting out, the running away, or the constantly trying to push the buttons, or the argumentatively, or crying, and all those type of behaviors are associated to trauma, and they're not necessarily associated to being rebellious. And usually we see these behaviors we see the young person as the problem, rather than the behaviors being as a result of trauma. But that doesn't mean that with the correct help and support, that a young person can overcome that and start to find different ways of dealing with the traumatic symptoms through coping skills and other methods. So it's very important for us to acknowledge that, right? When it comes to adults, some of the things you can expect is that, of course, not being able to the lack of trust, the lack of not being able to connect properly, or being able to speak about their trauma right away. Usually people, service providers, have this perhaps this unfunded expectation that survivors of trauma should be speaking their truth right away, and that is a very bad expectation, because it takes time, it takes rapport, it takes connection for people to speak their truth at the right time and at the right moment. In recovery, when it comes to expectation, how long this can take for somebody to overcome their trauma, or to accept help for mental health, that process can take time, can take months, sometimes can take years, and that is just. And I think the understanding of the fluidity of trauma, it is going to help you a lot when it comes to understanding the symptoms and the mental health symptoms that a person who have experienced trauma. So when it comes to this, there's not one set of time, there's not one expectation you should have, but I would recommend asking people what do they need in order to work towards achieving emotional and psychologically well-being, and allowing them to dictate what is the best way for them to work towards that. And of course, offer solutions, offer referrals for mental health counseling, and offer referrals for other type of services that are attached to trauma. And I think to quote Amy, who is a guru when it comes to trauma-informed care, it's not what's wrong with people, it's what happened to people. And it's reframing that question, and even more going farther into it, and says, what happened to this person that can explain the behaviors, that can explain what this person is going through. And again, these questions are not for you to ask people. This is for you to internalize what happened to this person that leads into acting out, or leads into perhaps more trauma-related symptoms. So really acknowledging that yourself and putting really the work into it, I think it's very important for us to, when it comes to the recovery of a survivor of trafficking. It takes time, it takes a rapport, it takes connection, and the appropriate people in the case to ensure that the person is being seen as a whole.
I also want to add just a couple of quick things. I know we're coming down to time, but quickly, one, it's also important to know that the trafficking experience that a survivor might have had and the trauma around that might not be the only trauma that they are experiencing. Sometimes some of our clients will say that the trafficking is actually not the most traumatic thing that has happened in their life. And so also recognizing that there can be multiple layers of trauma that's happening that can make it complex when talking about treatment or talking about healing or that process. I also want to point out that mental health recovery not only is different for every person because everyone's experiences are different, as well as Swamir's points out that neurologically trauma impacts the brain in similar ways so that we can understand it and we can look at certain symptoms as a trauma response. But it actually is going to impact each brain very differently, depending on the age of the trauma, depending on the length of time. And third, I also just really want to mention that it's important to be culturally sensitive when we're talking about treatment and recovery, that Western style talk therapy is not always the most appropriate intervention for survivors of trafficking, and identifying that different cultures have different methods of handling trauma that is important to support when we're offering solutions to our clients, and finding solutions and interventions that are out of the box, quote unquote, of Western ideology. That's all.
Thank you so much. All right, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next question. Amy, what supportive services should be provided to survivors?
Well, I think this is the perfect question to go quickly on because it's so narrow. I'm just kidding. So I think just in trying again to be careful of our time, I think that the most important thing here is to have a solid plan with any other organization that the client is also receiving services from, so that both organizations and of course then the survivor can be clear on who they go to for what. I think that some of the of course unintentional triggering and re-traumatization that we've had here is by not communicating clearly enough with our shelter providers about what we can and cannot, or what we will and can provide here at the Institute versus within the shelter, and just being on the same page with that. So I think that overall is the most important thing. And the other thing to just reiterate, given the last question, is that we've created something here, and it's not rocket science, but we're so used to safety planning with survivors. We actually created we call it a well-being safety plan, and we use that so that survivors can create a plan for themselves, going back to what Stephanie indicated before about the importance of having something written down that they can revisit about when they get when they get triggered, what are the strategies that they can implement to help regulate their emotions, to help calm them down, to give them support. And again, it has choice and empowerment for them within that service.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy. And our final question is for Swamir's. What unique needs do survivors have that shelters should consider?
That is another loaded question. These are very, very important questions when you're working with a shelter and hoping and developing a relationship and ensuring that those needs are being met. I think one of the biggest the very unique needs of survivors is their privacy. Is their their ability to have their own space, right? And this was a big one for us because the Salvation Army here has a facility that is huge. It can take 192 people in one big space. But when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about the neurobiology of trauma, the impact on the brain, and then we continue to talk about the very unique needs. The most apparent need was their privacy and that space, having their own room if possible, or having one space for where people with similar experience can share the space. That was a big one. We didn't only hear it from our clients, but also from the advocates working with our clients. But also when it came to their access to phones, for example, people, some shelters ask their cell phones to be people in the shelter cannot take their cell phones in. That is absolutely unnecessary, and it can leave can leave people without a safety net, without that safety, and a phone can be a safety net for people. So that was two of the things that we had to work through, like the space where people, the living quarters, perhaps. Then then the access to communicate with people through having access to a cell phone, through their own technology to communicate with people. Then when it came to the cultural and religious needs, a lot of came down to how do people want their meals, right? It was so very important because most of our clients have been away from their culture and their religion and their food for so long that most of our clients, what they're yearning for is to be able to cook back their meals. So having access to a kitchen, perhaps to be able to bring back a piece of themselves, was pivotal for their recovery and for their ability to build their life out of a trafficking situation. And lastly, it was in the understanding of people not wanting to participate in large group discussions or large group activities. Most of our clients, what they wanted to have is their own space, their own time, because when they're going into a shelter, are most likely to be immediately after a trafficking situation or immediately after then understanding their trauma. So that moment, their space was very, very important. So not having perhaps the shelter not having the expectation or not having the requirement that their clients were at every single activity that being put by the shelter. That was one of the 4 unique things the survivors need to have when it comes to a shelter: is access to their cell phones, access to perhaps independent living quarters if possible, understanding if they're not being fully participation in other activities, and 2 and 3, even being able to cook being able to cook their own meals and being able to feel some type of power over themselves again.
Great. Thank you so much, Somirs. I know that all these questions have, again, like y'all mentioned, are, loaded questions, and there's so much more that we want to cover. Unfortunately, we are at time, and so we won't be able to take any additional questions during this live chat, but please feel free to reach out. We want to make sure that if you need resources, ideas, or support, that we can provide that for you. And like Somirs had mentioned earlier, reaching out to Freedom Network when you have questions around practices or intakes, etc., please go ahead and email us. We just posted the email on the chat box. Also, you can see there the Freedom Network Housing Project page, which you can also sign up for communication, and where we'll also be updating and sending upcoming webinars. Like Stephanie had mentioned, next month we are planning a webinar on trauma-informed practices in shelter, and really highlighting the practices that you can implement in every shelter, in a domestic violence shelter, in a trafficking specific shelter, and in a homeless shelter, because we want to come with the assumption that regardless of where an individual is receiving services, they have experienced some sort of trauma, and they should not have to self-identify as a survivor of human trafficking in order to receive those trauma-informed services. So just look out for that. You can also visit our resource library to get more tools and materials that can support your work. And again, we want to thank you and thank our presenters for all the wonderful work that they put into this and for sharing their expertise. And we will be talking to you all next month. Thank you again.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.